So welcome everyone. I want to thank the Enfield Library reference librarian Lisa Sprague, who's just leaving, for hosting this program. In the first photo, Doc is seated on the Walnut Street Cafe in Palmer, Mass. Okay. Sometimes when you reflect on your own life, you don't know how much one person impacts it. And this is how Doc impacted me. So I met him when I was a senior at Enfield High, and I took his Enfield history, the political cartooning, and the film class. And then from there, I became interested in Enfield history, and I took some classes at Westfield State in the University of Massachusetts, and got into like town planning, city planning, because of my interest with Doc, showing his pictures on the town of Enfield. He was my mentor. I did my student teaching with Jack Lyons and Doc Celio, and then I worked with Doc in the early 90s. He was a colleague. And then I started my career at the Lamagna Center with the alternative program, and that's this building in the middle. It doesn't exist anymore. They took it down a couple of years ago. He had his film and slide processing done at Colonial Camera, and that was my future father-in-law. I met my wife at the camera store. And then in the lower right-hand corner, this picture was taken 25 years ago. That's a picture of my daughter that I'd bring her to breakfast, and Doc would always have his camera out and would take pictures. So he's really affected my life, getting my master's at UMass, working for the town of Enfield, and then creating the alternative program in Enfield. Okay, so the presentation this evening will cover the early years, like college, his career at Enfield High and EHS staff, other Enfield jobs. He was a club advisor for many different programs and other interests, and then we'll talk about his Connecticut / Enfield history class. So some of the photos going across, this is on Earth Day. He's pulling a rope back in 1970. This was at one of the sporting events at the Carl Angelica Field. This is from the yearbook, and here he is in the front row. And Jean, who's in the audience, is in the second row with Greg Chandler and Cookie Brummage. This was Cool Schools. Channel 3 would go around to the different high schools, and it was almost like a pep rally for the high school, and you could see Doc is really involved. He's in the front row with all the students. And then in the 1950s, he was in the Army. Here, one of his side jobs was a writer for the Enfield Press in the 1970s and 1980s. Okay, he was born on the 4th of July in 1934 in Concord, New Hampshire up here. He moved about 20 times by the age 20, he told me. First in the family to go to college, and he attended across the state, and Keene is right here. It was called Keene Teachers College. The reason why he went there was a shortage of teachers in New Hampshire, and he went there to become a teacher. So he attended the college from 52 to 54, and he ran out of money. And he had to go into the Army from 1954 to 1956. And back then you could do a 2-year stint. Instead of today, you have to do a minimum 4-year. Doc Taylor joked that his job was to keep North Korea from invading Paris. He returned back to college and graduated. And at Keene, and here's this picture happens just to be a yearbook picture. And then at Keene, he met Evelyn Binmore, and the two married in 1958. Okay, so in 1958, Frank and Evie married, and then 1958 to 1961, the Pinney School is located on Route 19, and I went out, my father-in-law owns a camp in Wales, and this is a private residence now, but this was a 4-room schoolhouse, and this is where he started his career. And then he went to Ellington Junior High and taught math for 1 year. All right. Doc and Evelyn relocated to U.S. Army base in Stuttgart, Germany, right here. They educated children of U.S. Defense Department and Red Cross personnel stationed outside the city of Stuttgart. They returned in '63 following the birth of their son Andrew, and later a second child, Jeffrey, in 1969. And Andrew and Jeffrey are here this evening. Okay, 1963, 1964, Doc was looking for a job, and he heard Enfield was hiring, and he fell in love when he looked over from Enfield to Suffield. The view outside his classroom was beautiful. So going from the second, from left to right, Jack Lyons, Mr. Tenero, Mr. Gross, Frank Gall. Bob Campbell was a social studies teacher before English. Mr. Robbins, Chet Blair was a social studies before he became an English teacher. And then Frank Taylor, Doc, is seated all the way, sitting on the, all the way to the left. Carol Bruce, Miss Biggis, Miss Silverman, Miss Brill, and Eddie Bolin. Okay, the view outside, this is from a 1965 yearbook. You can see Malinsky's Pond, and Malinsky owned about 3 or 4 tobacco barns. And unfortunately, in the 1970s, they happened to have a fire, it seemed like every year, and the fire would bring down the tobacco barns. I remember playing hockey on Malinsky's Pond, and now there's a housing subdivision down here off of Bridge Lane. So he took pictures year-round, and here you can see the pond, and it's, you know, this is still probably in the 70s or 80s. And sometimes I'd be in that classroom where I taught, and if you look real close, you can see it looks like a picture, and there's cars moving on 159. And then sometimes you could see the railroad cars. I went to St. Joe's, which is down on Pearl Street a little further, and when the trains come by, you'd get distracted and you'd start counting 1, 2, and the nuns would put the shades down. All right, in the winter time, this looks like it's right, maybe it's an early release. There were 2 teachers, John Talbot and Dave Frederick. They'd get all the kids going at 9 o'clock. Oh, it's early release, and there wouldn't be one, and the kids would be mad. I remember we'd have, me and my friends, when we were in high school, we'd have toboggan fights going down. There would be 2 toboggans, and then you'd try to get the other people off their toboggan. And you could go down, quite a ways. You can see this is where the baseball field is, and you could get halfway to the football field, depending on if it was icy conditions. All right, Doc was one of the first people at the high school in the morning with Jerry Rossi and Gail Darden would be the first 3 together. And you can see this is the steeple for the Congregational Church, and these are the lights from the tennis court. All right, and then sometimes it looked like a Dr. Zhivago movie. You'd get the fog rolling in off the river. Okay, Doc went back to school in 1975, and he completed his doctoral thesis on Shaker education at the University of Connecticut. And here you can see right here, this is Shaker Road, and it happens to be Taylor Road also, going all the way down here. And this is like the main prison today, located out there. All right, in 1975, they dedicated the yearbook to Doc Taylor and Jack Lyons, and you can see Doc, Andrew, Evie, and Jeffrey, and then he's right here laughing, and then this is a picture of the Suffield home in Suffield. All right, he received many awards, one from the social studies teacher in 1982, from the Daughters of the American Revolution, Teacher of the Year in 1985, and then he became Social Studies Department Chairperson in 1993 to 2012. All right, so Doc Taylor's given a talk, and this is the Polish home right here on the corner of Alden and Church. And he's given a talk to the group Voices for Thompsonville, and he talks about Orrin Thompson and his carpet company, and he discusses the different immigrants coming in, the Polish, the Irish, the Scotch, and he talks about the constant strikes. He ends his speech and he sits between me and Sean Crane, and he slides over. And I can't believe, this is happening. And fortunately, the police chief, Carl Safraza, and fire chief, Frank Alimo, happened to be there. And Paul Neighbors was another fireman, and he got his bag. They called EMS, and they revive him, bring him to the hospital. He had a heart attack, and then they saved his life. And then he returned about 2 weeks, that year, and that was in 2008. Okay, this is from the 2012 yearbook, Doc Taylor in 1971, and then in 2012. So he taught 49 years in Enfield and 55 overall. Okay, I'm going to go through this. He had a lot of friends at Enfield High, and he was always taking pictures. So Jerry Rossi, Val Kropanicki, Bob Campbell, Jack Lyons, Denny Gerard, Linda Miller, Dennis Murphy, a young George Rippish, Chet Blair, Dave Frederick. This was a mannerism of Bill Fogarty. He'd always be going like, knock it off, and he captured that. Tony Torrey, Leo Iaconello, and Elizabeth Mullen. All right, this is my cousin Eileen Malley, was a business teacher and secretary. Poppy Fowler, Mike DeRose, Rachel Lawrenson, John Talbot, Mike Austin, Frank Gall, Mrs. Parakilis. This is my aunt Maureen Riley. This is Helen Brill. This person, Bob Brummage thought it was a McCarthy, not Dick McCarthy, and nobody really knows. Does anybody know Tom or Jim Liberty was a French teacher? Does that look like him at all? No. And then Paul Lucius was a Spanish teacher. Cookie Brummage, Jack Lyons, and Steve Smith, and he is here this evening. This is when I had more hair. Dick Gray, Don Hollister, Carl Angelica, and Rich Pellin. All right, this looks like it could be anywhere USA, you know, this Peter Stasko. It looks like from some movie or, you know. Unfortunately, they had a fire some years later, and all these simulators, you know, burned.
That was in 1970, 69.
This is Sean Crane with Gwen Eiffel. She was the NBC PBS reporter up in the New Hampshire primary. Jim Robbins with a mop on his head. This is Butchie Hajosi and Jackie Smith, and every year they do the Heimlich maneuver, and they would do, you know, that. This is Harry Tatoyan, was the principal in the 50s and 1960s. Mark Dennis, and then these are the EHS carolers. Let's see. Florinda Valenti, Barbara O'Neill, Eileen Michaels, Maureen LaFrancis, Mr. Duffy, Mr. Murphy, Sue Gray, and Jan DeVilder. All right, I think this is one of the last ones. Doc Taylor with Susan Bisowitz. She's currently the lieutenant governor. Sean Crane and Doc Celio. Richard Prunty and Mr. Purcello. This is Greg Chandler before a prom. The teachers had a bowling league, so he's in his suit. Jack Stachio, Doc, Mr. Fletcher, John Fletcher, and Mr. DeFilippi. This picture was taken, Doc, we'll talk about it later, but he was the advisor to Schools Match Wits. And Denny Gerard, Bob Kramer, Carl Olin, and Mr. Celio, Doc Celio, would, you know, be a team against the Enfield High students. Lisa Wanzer and Holly Simmons. And then this is the Fermi Social Studies Department. This is across the street from the Boston State House. This is from the Civil War. Where's Mr. Crane? 54. What regiment? The 54th. And it's a huge, it's like 40 by 20, the whole sculpture. It's really huge. All right. Mr. Duffy, Mr. DeFilippi, there's that Mr. Crane again. Chad Ellis, Cindy Kelleher, I can't come up with her name. Doc Taylor with his class, Sue Gray.
Anita Raposa.
No, Sandy Arndt, Judy Jocelyn, Pam Gregory, and Jack and Ann Lyons. They were very good friends with Doc and Evie. All right. Other Enfield jobs that he had was working in the engineering department, and he worked as a cartographer with Bill Fogarty. This is a picture in the late 60s, and this is when you can see that the town green was much smaller. North Main Street is right here, and that took up most of the green. After urban renewal in the 70s, all of these buildings were taken down on North Main Street and Enfield Street. The reason, there were two lights. There was a light at Elm Street and then a light right here at North Main. And they made the town green a lot bigger, and they got rid of all those businesses on North Main Street. So when he was working at the town hall, he came across, this is the presidential section, and he noticed that Fillmore only had one L. So he changed it. He added an L, and his department head said, "You got to take it away." He goes, "Well, it's spelled incorrectly." He goes, when the subdivision got approved, it got approved Filmore. So the town council would have to go back and approve it with the two L's, and there's only one L in Fillmore. And then he made a joke in one of the articles. He said, "Well, at least they got Taylor right." All right. So he wrote also for the Enfield Press. Why is Enfield named Enfield? And in the article, he talks about Enfield was actually part of Springfield, and some people thought that it was the end, E-N-D, like the last field, the Enfield. I don't think, he talks about it, but there's not much merit to that. The second one was Pynchon from Springfield was from just north of London, and that's where Enfield, England is from, and I believe that's how Enfield got named. And then there was a third possibility, was a mythical beast from Enfield, Middlesex, and it had, like the hindquarters of different, like a rabbit and the chest of a hound and so on. But I think it's more of the Enfield, Middlesex. He'd always would write about different people, and this Trapper Billy Rabbit was an interesting character. And he was born about 1903. He lived on the corner of Alden and Enfield. There used to be a gas station there. The father worked on the north side of Alden Avenue, and there was a brickyard called the Alden Brickyard. The family moved to Skiddaco, and the father worked at the Stowe's Paper Factory. So if you're familiar with where the Powder Hollow Brewery, right behind that's where the Stowe's manufacturing paper company was. Billy went to school on Skiddaco School on Broadbrook Road, and at 14 quit school to work at the carpet mill. Then he worked for Amos Bridge, and he was one of the first people in the last explosions at the Hazard Powder Company in 1913. Him and his friend were one of the first people there. The plant never reopened, being the third largest in the country. In 1920, Billy hunted and trapped fox for pelts, and he lived on Taylor Road, and he collected artifacts along Raffia Road and the Scantic River. And there were two other brothers, the Thompson brothers, and if you go along Raffia Road in 1938, there was a hurricane, and it's where Arrow, Chief, and Indian Run are, the whole hillside ran off. And the Thompson brothers, found deposits there, and then along South Maple Street, they found the second one. Well, Ledger Star knew that information, and that's why he named the streets, Indian Run, Arrow, and Chief in that area. All right. He also talked about this Harold Paddy Green. He was born in 1896 in Lancashire, England. He worked at the carpet mill. He was a World War I U.S. Army veteran, and that you can see he's buried on Enfield Street. He was original member of the Thompsonville Grays Athletic Association. Their building just burned down a couple years ago. On Cottage Green, if you go down to Stuntuck Street, Cottage Green is like a U-shaped street, and there used to be a real green there, and they had a band shell later. That's where the Grays Club practiced. They'd have the games at Mount Carmel on Sundays. And then he was the president of the Town Recreation Youth Center, and like I said, he was buried on Enfield Street. Okay. One of the articles, we could have lived in Massachusetts. So during this colonial period, in the 1600s, England really didn't care, but the states, the colonies, would always dispute, where the actual line was. So the line basically was like that straight across, but Woodward and Saffery were hired surveyors, and they did an odd thing. They left the Boston area, instead of, you go in order as you're going to survey. They got into a boat around Cape Cod, around Rhode Island, came up the Connecticut River, and basically put a point on Windsor and said, oh, the line's right here. So Connecticut, the colony was not too happy, and they said, we're not giving you anything, So Connecticut, Suffield, and Woodstock, they want to be part of Connecticut. The taxes are cheaper, they're closer to Hartford. They didn't want to go all the way to Boston. They have this famous poster of Boston, the view of the world from Boston's viewpoint. 90% of it is Boston. Like a quarter inch is Worcester, then they have the hills as another quarter inch, and then the rest of the world. So they knew, the people from Connecticut knew that they'd be better off in Hartford. So the disputes go back and forth, and finally, the notch that you have in Suffield, Connecticut gives that up, and then right near the state line, you can see where the Enfield is right here. If you're at North Maple Street, there's a mobile station, and I think it's Maple Street in Long Meadow, and it goes all the way across. Well, if you get to like Washington Road, after that it starts going at a diagonal. So all that land from the Pride going up to Maple, there's a light, maybe there's the second light. All of that was once Enfield, Connecticut, but they gave that up in the dispute. All right, he was advisor of the Enfield History Club in 1970. And then in 1970, they had the Life Club. And I gotta look at my notes on this one. A group of Enfield High students became concerned about environmental changes in town and began to work on improvement. Students believed that modern man were as mindless as the Arctic animals, the lemmings, which periodically surge into a mass suicidal frenzy. The students chose the acronym LIFE, Lemmings Interested in a Favorable Environment. LIFE members worked with Frank G, you can see here swinging on the rope, with Doc Taylor also. They went to seminars, they got the school from incinerating plastic lunch plates. The police were called, they said this man was swinging with, students, in the Scantic River, and the students had to stop the police from arresting him. And he goes, no, he's our teacher. Here, so Doc took this photo, and then there's Robert Thayer took this picture right here, this black and white. And then this is a postcard. This is the Scantic River. And then this is the canal. They had over 125 buildings from Potter Hollow going all the way out to Bailey Road. And they did everything there, which was amazing. All right. So Life receives the state dedication, and this is a copy of the cover. This is in the reference section if you wanted to read it. And Ella Grasso was the Secretary of State, and she gives, they dedicate it to this life group in Enfield. And then George Newman is here. He got about 350 students in the 1970s to clean up the trash and get the trees out of the river, and they actually put water, they diverted water back into the canal. And then Robert Thayer, this gentleman right here, took this photo and this from El Grasso, the dedication, are in that book. All right. Here's Doc here and over here, getting some of the wood out of the river. He was also the advisor of School Matt Schwitz. Doc worked with Bill Fogarty and later with Steve Smith. All right, and here you can see Doc with one of the teams. This is that cool school. This is Mark Dixon. He still is at Channel 3. And these are the trucks outside the gym area. All right, before, this picture was like 2010, later in Doc's career, but the youth vote really began in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So Doc would always invite the local reporters. This is John Zaroli from the Springfield newspapers, Frank Pyro from the Enfield Press, Kevin Johnson from the Enfield Press, and Tim Jensen from the Press and the Patch would be invited. All right, so this is from Doc's collection. This is Governor Meskel. This is inside one of the classrooms at Enfield High. Meskel, his downfall, he went skiing once in January or February, got stuck. He couldn't make it back to Connecticut, and that was his downfall, and he didn't get reelected for that miscue. All right, El Grasso is right here. This is at the groundbreaking at Hallmark Cards on Bacon Road. Governor O'Neill, Teddy Plamondon, and this is at the town hall. You can just make it out. This was the Purple Heart Museum, was supposed to be in Enfield, and behind the Parkway Pavilion, they were supposed to build this beautiful monument, and some of the locals they wanted control, and the Federals, people came in and they were going to take care of it, but there was an argument on who was going to be in control. The El Grasso Turnpike, you can barely make out Bradley Bowl right here. So Doc was there for the unveiling of El Grasso Turnpike, Route 75 in Windsor Locks. El Grasso died in 1980. All right. Doc would also go up the Big E, I think it's next week it starts. So Governor Jody Rell at the Big E parade. Brad Davis went to Enfield schools. And then here he is, John Rowland and his wife, Patty Rowland. Toby Moffett, and this next 3 or 4 photographs are of people that represented Enfield in the U.S. Representative District. So that's at Enfield High. Nancy Johnson is here. You can see Eddie Bolin against the radiator. Nancy Johnson was from 1983 to 2007, so she was actually the 6th, and then because of population loss, we went to 5 districts. If it wasn't for Nancy Johnson, she secured historical renovation grants to build the Bigelow apartments. There's 471 apartments. It's like a 25-acre site. If it wasn't for her, it would be a mess down there. It really saved Thompsonville. All right. This is a picture of Joe Lieberman. There was a program they still have called Close Up, and this was the Washington, D.C. trip. These are some Enfield High students, and Doc got a good picture of Senator Lieberman. He recently passed away. Doc captured Teddy Kennedy with the Talarita family back in 2006. Teddy Kennedy was campaigning for Ned Lamont when he was going for representative. All right, and then on the steps of Town Hall, Nancy Pelosi, they're all campaigning for, this is Jim Sullivan, was running for U.S. representative. So this is Kathy Tallarita, Steve Jarmock, Bill Kiner, Nancy Wyman, Carol Sensky was the Enfield Party chairwoman, Kevin Sullivan, lieutenant governor, Chris Dodd, senator, and John Larson, representative.
Wait, that's Nancy Pelosi?
Yeah,
She was in the Enfield.
yeah. So that was back in 2004. All right, Doc's other interests, the Muppets. So he had a film class, so he loved Disney. So here's Peter Pan, Mickey Mouse. And then some of the classics, The Godfather. Some people say The Citizen Kane is one of the best movies. He'd always show that. The Marx Brothers, Duck Soup, Saving Private Ryan, Jaws, the original King Kong, and then different Alfred Hitchcock, Psycho, Slapshot, and then a good old Clint Eastwood, Josie Wales. All right, and then Cy Becker, he was a movie reviewer from Channel 22, and he'd bring him down. I remember he was at Kosciuszko one year. I was there, and then he'd come to Enfield High as well. All right, Doc had a political cartooning class. So the caricature to the right isn't the nicest, but Rich Lines has the Mickey Mouse ears. You can see Doc's eyes, the Mickey Mouse, and then he's got his scissors and maybe funny papers cutting. We learned about Thomas Nast. He was Harper Weekly. He's also known for doing the Santa Clauses historically, Thomas Nast. And then he'd always, Boss Tweed right here from New York City. Rick Stromsky is this gentleman right here next to Mr. Duffy. He's a cartoonist from Suffield, Connecticut. And then Herbert Block went by Herblock. And you can see here Nixon is with the tapes, and he's got I am, and he goes, not a crook, or I am a crook. And then the not in the middle. All right. Sean Crane and Doc Taylor went to numerous U.S. Huskies Final Fours, and there's a poster over here of the original one. So Doc got these two pictures, Chris Daly, and then Gino, and then this is the 1995 Sports Illustrated cover with Jen Rosati. All right, this was the same year, 1995. This is the Gold Key Dinner. This is for all the top coaches, players in the state of Connecticut. And that year, Cookie won her 5th field hockey title. And then this was the first of Gino's, I believe he's got 9 or 11 championships, and they went undefeated. So Doc took those two photos. All right. Sean Crane and Doc Taylor, I don't know if it was more Sean Crane, chasing down the Carters. Here, you tell the story.
Well, the Secret Service almost pulled their guns on us. We went down to Plains, Georgia, one of our trips when we used to have a full week's winter break in February. So we went down to Plains to see some of the Civil War sites, civil rights sites, etc. And we said, hey, we hear that Jimmy Carter, you can go to church with Jimmy on Sundays. So we were too late for church. We arrived in the afternoon. But we were standing outside of his church, and there's literally a big smiling peanut statue in homage to his background as a peanut farmer, I guess. Then who pulls up? A Secret Service vehicle and then another vehicle behind it with the Carters in it. And we're all invited into their Baptist service. So at the end of the service, we talked with them a bit. Actually, during the service, we had to give what you call, if you're Baptist background, you know, it's a Baptist testimonial. In essence, telling us what we're about, why we're there, and so on. Jimmy was impressed that Doc was teaching for up until that point 47 years. He said, 47 years, that's a long time. So at the end of the night, we were talking with members of the congregation. We noticed the Carters leaving, and they went outside. I said, Doc, let's try to get a picture with the Carters. He's like, okay. So we ran out the door in the pitch black of night shouting, Mr. President, Mr. President. And literally, a Secret Service turned, and I saw the hands, but then they realized we were just two loonies that just wanted a picture with the President and First Lady, so there you go. You know.
All right, thank you, Mr. Crane. All right, so Doc would do research at the Enfield Public Libraries, and this is our lovely Lisa Sprague, who was just here earlier. This was originally a Carnegie library, and there was a gentleman named John Pickens, and he wrote to Andrew Carnegie to get funds to build this library. And back then, Carnegie would give half of the money, you know, to build it, and then the town would have to, you know, put up the other half. Well, it got voted down the first time by Enfield residents, saying, we don't need libraries, it'll be a white elephant, we don't need it. Well, Mr. Pickens didn't give up, and in 1914, they got the funds and they built the library. So this is on the corner. This is the Pearl Street Library, the Carnegie Library, and then in the 1950s, this is the John Pickens Library. So for Mr. Pickens to get the first library, they honored him, and this is on School Street, right next to the basketball court. And this was a library from 1950, roughly, to 1969 when this library opened. So they closed, that in 1969. All right, Doc's ties. So this one is fish, this is flowers, this is the one I selected. Jeffrey and Andrew at Doc's service they must have had 400 ties, if not 500. And they said you could take a tie, and I always loved Bugs Bunny, so I got that tie. Here you've got Einstein, you have Halloween, so he'd have different, every holiday he'd have, he'd have numerous holiday ties. So he had quite a collection, and I believe Jean has her tie on tonight.
Yes, with the camera, because Doc loved cartoons and he loved photography. And I have the quilt. So he wore a high school every day?
I can't remember him not having a tie. He always seemed to have a tie on.
You know where that started, Jim? Sorry, and I could be corrected, but Joe Gallucci, he was the principal.
Yeah.
And Doc used to dress a bit informally, and Gallucci made a comment about that one day, and he says, well, I'm going to show him, and he wore a tie every day after that. So. Doc captured this photo. This is the Enfield substation on Weymouth Road, and the North Tower beams were dedicated 10 years after, so September 11th, 2011, on Weymouth Road. And the local officials, Mayor Scott Copen, Congressman Joe Courtney, State Rep Kathy Tallarita, John Kissel, Fire Chief Edward Richards, Lieutenant Brian Ellis, and Deputy Chief Paul Januszewski standing in front of the North Tower beams. They started the parade in East Windsor right on 140, and then came up
Steel Road, and then down Weymouth, and then they had, the dedication to the towers. All right. Doc would always bring the students to the Enfield Street Cemetery. This right here is the Hazard family plot. And then this was there's 3 driveways that go into the Enfield Street Cemetery. And this one's all the way to the right. And there's a gentleman named Lewis Burns, and he was a builder. And if you know where High Street is, there's Burns Avenue. Lewis Burns built all those houses on that street. And he dedicated this arch to his wife. And if you look behind the bushes, it's dedicated, the arch is dedicated to his wife back in the 1930s, 1940s. This was the Spanish students. They had a Spanish exchange every year. And they did some rubbings. This is the main entrance to that Hazardville old cemetery. And then these are, this one and this one are in the, do you remember where Cran's Candy Castle is? There's Pleasant Road. On the north side, there's a small cemetery. And it's interesting, it says in memory of James Butler, who was killed in a well October 20th, 1799. He was in the American Revolution for, 3 or 4 years, didn't, die there, but he died in a well. And then this other one, in memory of Mr. Elijah Fish, who was drowned on the Enfield Falls, Connecticut River. Over the years, a lot of people, the river the water is moving fast. And back then, especially in these brownstone markers, they really go into depth on how the person died. And some of them are really sad. There was one where a mother and her child, died in childbirth. So some of them are, really hard to read. Okay. Doc traveled in New England with his wife and worldwide travel, Germany, Iceland, Moscow, China, Easter Island, Machu Picchu, which is located in Peru, but he did a lot of traveling worldwide. All right, and then we'll end up here with Connecticut and Enfield history. So here's Doc at a sporting event at the football field. It could be soccer or field hockey or football. He went to all of them. And then the Colt firearms, he would take pictures of Hartford. Colt had this blue dome. He was inspired by his visit to Russia. It was a way to advertise his factory himself and his connections to Russia. All right. So we'll go. So here's Harriet Beecher Stowe. One of the schools in town is named after her, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Eli Whitney had the Whitneyville gun. Mark Twain was on the corner of Beach and South Road. Let's see, this is, Henry Barnard. He was the Secretary of Education in Connecticut. Before CCSU, it was called the New Britain Normal School. He was the first principal of that institute. Here is Mark Twain's house. It's a great museum. And then here's the state capitol. I could talk about Barnum and Bailey. Here's a picture of Jimmy Carter came to Hartford. Here's Ella Grasso. And then Ribicoff was one of the representatives. The Hartford Whalers Hall of Fame. Nathan Hale. And then this is the Goodspeed Opera House. All right. One thing that I liked about Doc's classes is that he'd start with current events, and anything you wanted to talk about, nothing was off the table. So way back in the 1970s, marijuana was illegal, and Leo Arnone was one of the police officers that would try to get some of the high school students. The Enfield Cinema, up until 1969, 1970, was, they had the PG and R movies, and then that went X-rated because the Enfield Cinema went, out to Hazard Avenue. BFI, Browning Ferris, that was off of Mullen Road, and they wanted to put the toxic waste along Mullen Road in steel. And I remember practicing football, and they'd have all these meetings at Enfield High, and there was outrage that they were thinking of putting it in town. Right here is Craig Janney when he made the Bruins. Right here, this is where they were building Route 190. This is Pearl Street. This house is on the corner of Pearl and Fruit Terrace. Bookends was the bookstore at State Line. Urban renewal was going on. And then here's the Institute back in the 1960s. So it's come a long way. The outside of the building is beautiful. They still have a ways to go on the interior. And then this gentleman was Melanchinsky, and he was like a constitutionalist. He spoke out for Albert Visch during urban renewal back in the 1960s and 70s. All right. So Doc would also talk about the Native American Indians, along the Connecticut River. He talked about Adrian Block. Adrian Block was one of the first explorers coming up the Connecticut River. So he's coming up the river, he stops in Hartford, and if you're familiar with some of the neighborhoods, they named Dutch Point after him. And then there's also Adrian's Landing along the Connecticut River, that's also named after Adrian Block. So Adrian Block comes up further, he has a meal with Indians along the Connecticut River in South Windsor, and he doesn't reach Enfield. He gets these Enfield Rapids, it gets too shallow and he turns around. He leaves the Connecticut River and then goes on to Rhode Island, and that's where he finds Block Island. And Block Island is also named after Adrian Block. Some of the early Connecticut settlements are Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford, and the other being Springfield. If you look at the state flag of Connecticut, there's 3 vines, and they represent Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford. Springfield, William Pynchon is the leader there. He has a lot of goods, and it's difficult getting stuff up the river, and he has a warehouse, and it happens to be located at the time in Windsor, Connecticut, and it later becomes Warehouse Point, and that's why it's called Warehouse Point, because of Pynchon's warehouse. Enfield settled in 1680, and the 2 Pease brothers who come from Salem are the 2, and they bring about 30 other people with them, and they settle Enfield from Salem. 1692, they're lucky because 12 years later, that's when they have the Salem witch trials. So if they stuck around, and those mean little girls, if they didn't, like the Pease brothers, well, they could have been hung also. All right. This is a town plat, and one of the Pease brothers made this, and it really hasn't changed all that much. Hazard Avenue is just above here. Here is South Road. Post Office Road, that goes more on a slant, and then this is Oliver Road. See this little crook? That's where the double highway is still today. That's the high point. It's wet on both sides. That's why it goes in that crooked angle. So you have Kings Island. People had river access, and that's why the lots were put together close so that if there was an Indian attack, the houses were close together and they had river access. These lots went into the industrial park. So Interstate 91, when that came through, cut all these lots in half. So some of them were landlocked and some of them were later sold when the industrial park came through. So the Congregational Church, there was really no separation of church and state back then. So where the cemetery was, that was the first church. The second one, there's a boulder in 1741. There's the Great Awakening, and Jonathan Edwards gives a speech, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And in the English collection, all across America, they have these anthologies in 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, and that's Enfield's claim to fame in small print. It says, speech given in, 1741. The third Congregational Church is actually the Old Town Hall Museum today, and then the fourth one is the current one. And like I said, right here, going up, following the arrow, this would be where 91 is. And then the industrial park would be all in through here. All right. Here's Thomas Abbey in front of the Congregational Church. He was the drummer for the town, and right at the base, you can hardly see it, is right here, and he led about 90 men to Lexington and Concord when the British invaded. Doc took this picture in the 70s. It looks like a reenactment during the bicentennial. Doc with his students, this is the boulder that's left. And then the Reverend David Yale, on the Enfield Library website, there's about 150 pictures that they have, and Doc Taylor and Steve Smith, I think, worked on it together, and Doc had the slides for class, but they have them digitized, and you can go online and you can see these 150 pictures back in the early 1900s, and he went around town and it explains, who the person is and maybe the address on Enfield Street, but they went throughout town. All right, Ephraim Pease. This is on Enfield Street. This is when it had seen better days. This house was actually it was for a paint company. I don't know 100%. It might have been Glidden. It could have been a different company, but it really stands out, the red paint on the house. This is when it was almost condemned. All right, and then Doc talked about mills and farming, the Shakers, 91, Enfield Streets, businesses, residents and athletes, and then urban renewal. And he'd always talk about, North Thompsonville, Shaker Pines, Thompsonville, Hazardville, Skiddaco, and Enfield. Enfield covers the whole town, but there's 5 fire districts in town. And Enfield covers basically the historic district and the southern part of Enfield, and then along Weymouth Road. So one of our mill owners was Orrin Thompson. He was actually born in Suffield. In 1788, he founded the Thompsonville Carpet Company. The village is named after him. His mansion is on the grounds of the Felician Sisters, almost directly across from the Enfield Street School. His home, where the Montessori School is, the main building, his mansion is to the right. So this housing, so if you worked for the Bigelow, you rented from the Bigelow maybe, and these houses are on Bigelow and Hartford Avenue. Sometimes you worked a long time. This woman's name is Mary Conboy. She worked 50 years. On some of the retirement dinners, there's some people who worked 60, 65 years. They had semi-pro football, baseball, and basketball. They also had bowling, gun shooting, and golf. This is his mansion, Orrin Thompson's mansion on Enfield Street. Here's an aerial of what the mill looked like back in the 70s. And then this was in the Polish home at a strike meeting on the second floor. All right. This was the original high school. This was the Presbyterian church. This was when the pond was much larger. These are the cottages that the Bigelow or the Thompsonville Carpet Company built for the workers on Cottage Green. These still exist today. The smokestack was taken down. You can see the Enfield High jacket. Doc took this on the interior after the mill closed in '71. This is when it had seen better days. It looked like World War II down there. And this is a tie rod. This is what kept, it wasn't for decoration, it was to keep the building together. And there's hundreds of these on the outside of a lot of the buildings. And then this is White Mill. On the other side was the pond. And then it was called White Mill because of the white color of the building. And then the other mill was Colonel Augustus Hazard. This was his home and later becomes the Enfield Inn. And unfortunately, in 1969, it burned down. They had a 200-foot cherry wood staircase with gold leaf. It was beautiful. And the workman's tool sparked and it went up the staircase and it burned in minutes. His family plot, if you go down the main driveway and to the left is the Hazard plot. All right. The powder mill barn, if you go down South Maple Street before you get to the river on the right, that's where they kept the horses. So from 1830s to 1880s, they would have to bring it to the Connecticut River. The railroad would not take it. They'd have to go up. They had a road going up in Powder Hollow, and that would come to South Road, and then they'd go down Parsons Road, and then they'd put it on flatboats to Hartford, and then they'd bring it from there. And then this was Canister House. This was Canister Hill. So right here is like Hazard Avenue. And right about here, it starts curving, and this is South Road. Back then, you can see there's not too many trees. The kids would go sledding and almost hit the Canister House. This is basically, the building was on the Pitcher's Mound. All right, this poor woman, Ruth Blunden, married her first husband, and he died in an explosion. And his name was Alfred Blunden, and he died May 27th, 1898. He got remarried to Alfred's brother, Charles Blunden, and he died in an explosion on January 14th, 1913. So instead of offering the woman some, money, they offered her a job. So instead of, getting some money, they might have given her a small sum of money, but they gave her a job, and it was putting on labels on the canisters. All right. There's the Powder Hollow Barn in the 70s, Jack Lyons and Steve Smith, and then today how the Connecticut Scantic River looks. All right, tobacco was really big. This is the Raffia farm. You could raise your hand if you worked at the tobacco. So I worked 3 years. So in 1978, minimum wage was $3.40, and they had a thing called the farm wage, so they could pay me $1.70. And if you didn't like it, there were 500 kids waiting. You'd ride around Thompsonville for 45 minutes, and then get into the fields right at 7 because then it was cooler. And then if you're lucky, if it rained the night before, you'd start picking, and you'd have puddles to go through. But you really appreciate working tobacco, what farmers have to go through. This is the Jarmark farm off of Broadbrook Road. There's so many obstacles: hail, rain. There's a thing called blue mold, and it can spread from tobacco leaf from tobacco leaf. Hurricanes, that sometimes wiped out entire fields. All right, and then Doc went down to Thompsonville. This is Jack Ward, and this was his shop. He was the last Thompsonville cigar roller. Back, he said, in the early 1900s, he got paid pretty well, maybe, $5 more an hour than most people. And the Connecticut Valley basically goes from Middletown to South Deerfield, and we're known for the outside wrapper. So they have the cheesecloth, and they try to make that climate just like Cuba. And it was like Cuba because it was really hot. Here is Chester Pilch on the left, founder, and he purchased the Ralph Moody farm in 1937. So there's that Polish pottery store on Moody Road. The reason why it's called Moody Road is this Ralph Moody had his chicken farm there, and then he sold it to Chester Pilch. They were known for growing broilers and one of his largest farms in the world. There's a thing called sexting, and he'd make like $400 back in the 1960s in sexting chickens to make sure which sex they were, so you wouldn't waste time on the males. You'd have the females, and that was his job. And then he ended up selling to Deck Lab in 1969. So this is Moody Road right here. Right here you can see this is a brook, this is freshwater brook. So the Polish pottery would be about here. So they had it on both sides, and then where the police station and the senior center, that would have been part of the Pilch farm also. All right, the Four-Town Fair is this weekend. September, there's the picture right over here, the poster. So 1838, they wanted to have a contest like which town had, the best steers, and it started with Ellington, Summers, and Enfield, and then 2 years later, they added East Windsor. And years ago when it started, it would be in different towns, and I don't know which year, but Summers has it. It's been out there for the past 40 or 50 years. All right, State Line potato chips, potato farming. So if you're at the state line and coming into Enfield, the Carville farm was on Knox Avenue. It's like the first or second street on the left. And she would, they had State Line potato chips, and she sold out in the 1930s from 1919. And One of my earliest memories, I was in kindergarten at South School, and next to the Friendlies headquarters was the State Line headquarters. And we went there, and they'd have the potatoes coming down and, you know, into the fryer, and then they'd seal them, and that's one of my earliest, memories. So this goes back to 1919. Today, the potato chips are manufactured in Canada. You can go to Corona's and get a bag of these if you still want today. That's one of the few places that has them. All right. Dairying was very big, so the Smith Farm Dairy, Richard Smith on Hazard Avenue, so where the Jersey Mike's and what's the CVS, that area, that's where this farm was. And then the George Smith Farm was on Enfield Street. He had dairy and tobacco. And this is just on the south side of the Enfield Street Cemetery. Oop. All right, and here's Mr. Serrato's here. He was my baseball coach. I was the worst left fielder, right fielder you'd ever meet. We still won. In 1979, Bob Smith ran the restaurant, and we got Sundays for winning. This is Hazard Avenue. This is Middle Road. And then Palumba Drive would be right here. Walgreens would be here. This was the Smith Farm Dairy. Enfield or Fenton Ford would be right here, back in the 1960s. All right, there's also the Enfield Dairy, Semino Brothers, Dominic, Vincent, and Peter Cardoni. So from the Congregational Church, about 4 houses up on the same side was the Enfield Dairy. And they had the boxes just like Smith, and they'd send the eggs and the milk and whatever they had. Dominic's sons, Joe was the milk delivery, and John the dairy bar. And Vincent's sons, Francis was the milk farm. They had the Enfield Dairy Bars where the Enfield Congregational Church is, and then they had their own ice cream.
Where the credit union is.
Or credit union. Doc did his thesis on the Shakers. The Shakers came from England and France in the 1700s. Their leader was Ann Lee. They believed in direct communication with God, and they had visions, and they began to tremble, shout, and shake, and that's why they were called the Shaking Quakers, and then the Shakers sort of stuck. The Enfield Shakers were located in the northeast section of town, later called Shaker Pines. And I'll give you a brief. If you wanted to become a member, you'd have to be free of all debts, be free of all legal obligations, confess all sins, surrender all worldly goods, and sign the covenant, and then follow the rules of celibacy. So for some people, they lasted maybe 10, 20, 30 years, and some people, after maybe other of their friends passed away, or celibacy was too hard, they would leave. And then, like some other religions, at age 18 or 21, they would have to decide if they'd want to stay on. And it wasn't as simple as, I'm out of here. These are a lot of the people that they only knew. So it was you really had to figure out, if I leave, then I don't, know anybody. This is right here is the meeting house. This is difficult to see. There's pine trees in front of it. If you're going up Shaker Road, this is blocked by the trees. This is on the corner of Taylor and Moody. These are the Cebulski houses, and Doc has a number of, photos with the wildflowers. This is the Shaker cemetery plot. They knew they were leaving, so they stacked all the cemetery plots. In that area, the bodies are still underneath the ground. There's a black wrought iron fence, but the bodies go way beyond that. But they knew that they couldn't keep the cemetery because nobody would keep it up. This is where the cemetery is right here. This is Shaker Road. This is Taylor Road. And then the Cebulskis, this is Moody Road. They reused the original, they made them all white over here, and they reused, this is either on the prison grounds or on somebody's private property. They used some of the old cemetery headstones, and the Shakers didn't see a problem with this, like it wasn't sacrilegious, or they, you know, it was a good use of using the stone as a sidewalk. And then this is from a Baker Tilden map from 1869. This was the Shaker train station where the Lego soccer fields, the driveway, that's where it was located. All right, 91 came in the 1950s. This is the King Street. St. Pat's Cemetery is over here, and you're going north. This is Oliver Road, the Smith, or no, I'm sorry. This is South Road, and the Felician Nuns would be over here. This is Hazard Avenue. It looks like a clover leaf. The Hampton Inn would be right about here. This is the Diamond. This is Elm Street. Right here is the Friendlies. A little bit to the south is Wendy's. And then here's the Dunkin' Donuts, McDonald's. And then up here, originally it was the Food Mart and W.T. Grants. Today it's Ocean Job Lot and Kohl's. And then this is at State Line. This is Enfield Street. And then this is the last exit, exit 49 in town. Doc had some articles about street names and the census. And he'd talk about how it was strange how sometimes the last four digits, you know, would match 464, 654 over here. So the big growth in Enfield, in 1950, the population was about 15,000. It more than doubled in 1960. In the 60s, they were building a school a year to keep up with all the growth. And then it really peaked out in 1970. They had a bicentennial book called The Challenge of Change, and they thought that Enfield would be like 80,000. Never happened. It always stayed. And in 2020, we're about 42,000. And I don't think it's changed that much. All right, different street names. He wrote, and then he'd talk about all the different streets. The presidential section, all the, you know, the streets are named after presidents. That was a Ledger Star. Birdland was off of Abbey Road, so you had Red Wing, Bluebird, Flicka, Sandpiper, Bobolink. So his largest one was Southwood Acres. So we talked about the Native American, you know, Indian Run, Arrow, Chief. And then they had like weather names like Cloud, Moon, Sun, some of the star children's names. There's Dale, Donna, Doreen. No, Doreen. Doreen's, you know, so somebody told the story. She said she was the black sheep of the family, and that's why there was a street named after her. Landowners, you had Howard and Ernest Pierce sold their land. You had the space program, so you had Rocket Run in the 1960s, and then you had Lox Lane, so it wasn't like bagels and lox, it was liquid oxygen, and then there was Missile Street. North of JFK, you had Crystal Corner, Diamond Drive, Gem, Luster, Sparkle, and they had Campsite. And I'm friends with Gil Vassar, and he worked for Ledger Star in the 1970s, and I said, well, how do you get Campsite out of that? And he told me between Raffia Road and going toward the Scantic River, there was a Boy Scout hall, and it was called Camp Sheldon. And Camp Sheldon actually wrote a couple books on Enfield in the 20s and 30s, and that's why it's called a campsite. It just didn't go along with all the other streets. All right, and then Doc had like a before and after. This was the Angelica House on the corner of Belmont and Enfield Street. And then Burger King was there for like 6 or 7 years, maybe longer. And then it turned into the Chevaline. That was the exotic. They had like buffalo and snake and all this. You know, it didn't last long. And now it's Russo's Bakery, which has been there since the mid-'80s. Some of the businesses, Wilco's, Colonial Camera. This is the Thompsonville Hotel that was on the corner of Main and Pleasant Street. Crane's Candy Castle on King Street. Triana Oil Company. Mountain Laurel. Ooh. The headquarters for Lego on Print Shop Road. G. Fox and Company. Steiger's in the Enfield Square, Dairy Mart, and then Hallmark Cards on, I believe that's Bacon Road. All right, and then some notable residents. This is a picture of my father, Ed Malley, Tony Torrey, Martha Parsons, Ledger Star, Lena Angelica, Paul Robeson, Bob Tangway, Ralph Serrato. This is Edgar Parkman. Parkman School is named after him. He was the principal of Enfield High School from the 1880s to 1920, and he was superintendent for another 20 years. Edgar Parkman was forced to retire when he was 80, and that was about 1940. So this was during World War II, and there was a shortage of Santa Clauses. He's a Santa Claus at Johnson's Bookstore on Main Street in Springfield. Mary Lou Strom, she was the second female mayor. Leo Arnone. The first female mayor was Ann Petronella. This is Walter Scour and Father Paul from St. Adalbert's. They're trying to talk the people that own the Enfield Square land, the Legenzas, to sell so they can build Enfield Square. This is Thomas Alcorn. This is John Ashton. He graduated in 1965, roughly, from Enfield High School. He's the movie star. He was in the Beverly Hills Cop with Judge Reinhold and who's the comedian? Eddie Murphy. Angelo Lamagna was the park director from 1945 to 1985. He was my basketball coach. They'd have, in the spring, they'd have boxing matches, and they'd have 2 teams. And Enfield High or Kosciuszko would be standing room only, and they'd have, you know, children as young as 5 up to 18, and they had 2 teams, and they, you know, have a slugfest. Some of the matches they dance around, and others they just wail on each other for the minute. Peter King is here. He's going to give a talk about his career, and then it's going to help JFK sports. And then back in the 1700s, they didn't have any photographs, but there's Doc Taylor, I remember talking about Elijah Churchill. Before the Purple Heart, they had the Badge of Merit, and Elijah Churchill was born in East Windsor, but served in an Enfield regiment, and he was one of 3 people from Connecticut, and that's all that he gave, the Badge of Merit, and he was one of them. All right. Doc was always at different events, the boys basketball championship in 2004. He and Jack Lyons were at every graduation. And then Doc would be at, this was the homecoming parade. And then this was, they would bring back people. This is John O'Brien from 102. Pat Gill, I do not know the name of this woman. Frank Pyro, Don Marcotte. Does anybody know this police officer? I'm not sure on his name. All right, and then he'd be at different sporting events. Enfield High won back-to-back state titles. Enfield High won Division II in 1982. In 1983, this top pitcher, they won Division I. The same year, Fermi High School also won, so all the accolades for hockey that year went to Enfield in that one year in 1983. Karen Scavato was the archer that went to the Olympics. Craig Janney, when I was a senior, they won the first title, and then he went to Deerfield Academy, he went to Boston College, he went to the Olympics, he played for the Bruins, the St. Louis Blues, and about 3 or 4 other teams. And they had a parade for him. This is David Grigley, Don Cam, and Mike Usella. This was 1982 hockey. And the Spanswick brothers, this is Jimmy Spanswick, Ted Williams, and Billy Spanswick. My father took that photograph. Jimmy Spanswick just passed away this spring, and Billy passed away a couple years ago. And Billy pitched for the Red Sox, and back then it was a big deal because there were like only 12 teams in the 1960s to make it to Division II, or AA. And then the malls came in. So the Elm Plaza, Enfield Square, this is the Wilco's, Sage Allen. This would have been J. Homestock and ShopRite. You can see nothing, this is Palumba Drive, nothing. And then here's Kosciuszko, and not much happening on Hazard Avenue. All right, and the last thing we'll talk about is the urban renewal. Thompsonville had seen better days. The buildings were literally falling apart. This is on Main Street. This is Vincent's on Main Street. This is the Bigelow. And then this is on Pleasant Street. LaRussa's, a lot of the buildings are parking lots today. So this is, LaRussa's was across from Corona's. The Vish Bicycle. And then here you can see the center of Thompsonville. This is brown because it looks they're dredging it. And then this is before they put in the senior housing and then the Thistle Lane apartments. They just had a huge pipe burst in this area, and that's turning into a big problem. This is where the whole donut is, and you can see here there were businesses, and this is where the town green is. Right about where I'm pointing, that's where the World War II monument is. CBT was the bank back then. This was another car dealership where the CVS's, and you had a couple homes right here where it was Enfield Federal, now it's a M&T Bank. All right, so this is where I put on my Enfield Adult Ed hat on. So this is just, we offer citizenship, English as a second language, and different ways to get your diploma. So this is going back, this is from the 1920s when the new immigrants were coming in. So they'd have their name, their residence, employer. So BHCC was Bigelow Hartford Carpet Company. And then they'd have their boss, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Shields, Mr. Woods, and then their number. So then all the different countries, Greece, Italy, Canada, remember the French Canadians up north, Turkey, you know, the date they arrived, their status, schooling, okay. This is our brochure. We have some at the corner. I also have some free books from the Enfield Cemetery Association. You can take one if you'd like. We offer guitar. We have a community band at JFK. There's about 40 members. We have yoga, Pilates, golf. We have pet first aid, some walking tours, cooking classes, and then we have a bus trip to New York City on December 14th. So some of the walking tours that I'm doing are on Thursdays from 2:30 to 4:30, and we're in Thompsonville, or the Historic District. And then this coming Saturday, we're at Hazardville, and we're going to Smoothville Smoothies. We're doing something out at Shaker Pines, Powder Hollow, and then we're going to Collins Creamery. We're going to go along the baseball field, Dust House Road, and then along the river, and then we're going to go for ice cream after. And then the last one is Kings Island, the King Street Cemetery, and the Old Town Hall. Okay, so thank you very much. Any questions from anybody?
One thing I'd like to mention, Connecticut River and that canal was built because you were talking about the rapids. They stopped at the rapids and went back south, so they created the canal.
Right.
And went from Enfield all the way through Windsor
Yeah.
for both. But they don't use it at all now.
They closed it in 1971, and they built it in 1827 to 1829. By 1840, it became obsolete because the railroads came through. So then they used it, the businesses, you know, Dexter's and different businesses used it, and Alstrom owns it right now. So, anyone else? Yep.
Is this the first presentation you did about Dr.
Yes, so I'm giving the talk on September 26th with the Enfield Historical Society, and it's going to be on a Thursday here at 6 o'clock again.
But do his sons have anything to say to us?
Yeah.
Tell us about that. What?
What was it like living with a celebrity?
It was very much that. If you went anywhere, you'd have to sit there and patiently wait, talk to everybody.
Yeah.
Found
Which
it
you-
by name.
Which one's from far away? I bet it's you. I knew. Okay. Who had him for a teacher?
Hmm?
I didn't go to Enfield High. Who had him? For a teacher? Yeah. Who had him as a teacher? Lenny? Oh, what kids did? And then what did you do in later years, Lenny?
I was his mailman,
Ah,
1995 to 2019.
Louder, louder.
I was his mailman from 1995 to 2019. So I heard quite a few stories for years, especially in the summer. But his first year that he retired, he had a very tough time on the first day of school. He was actually kind of sick, but
Well-
he made it through.
You said he was looking across
Yeah.
at the school.
He actually walked the canal
Yeah.
trail.
Yeah,
And you could see the school on the first day.
yeah, but it was all right, it's all right.
Yeah.
So some of the posters along this wall, you can look before you leave. There's a Casablanca, and then there's Lion King, and then some Connecticut history, and then there's some maps over here of Enfield. We have some pencils, and then there's some adult ed bags in the books, you know, if you would like to take.
Andy, do you want me to show the quilt?
What's that?
The quilt, do you want
Oh,
me to
yeah,
show?
I mean, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Say who you are. Introduce yourself. Okay, so I'm Lisa, this is my cousin Karen. I went to the wrong high school. So Frank was a good friend of mine for 45 years, and when he passed, he had all those ties, and Andy was kind enough to let me pick all the ties I wanted. And Karen made a quilt for me out of the ties, so we'll share with you. I think she did an amazing job.
All right, so you can tell other people September 26th, 6 o'clock here. If they miss tonight, they can come, you know, on the 26th. So, all right, thank you very much.